It was 6 a.m. when Marcus realized something had to change. He sat at his kitchen table, coffee growing cold, replaying the same argument from yesterday. His boss had criticized his work in front of the entire team. One comment, that's all it took. One casual remark, and Marcus spent the entire night unable to sleep, his chest tight, his mind spinning with rage, and shame spiraling together like a toxic dance. He'd replayed the moment 100 times, 1,000 times, each replay adding another layer of humiliation. Marcus thought he was weak. He thought that's what successful people didn't do. They didn't let words affect them. They moved on. They stayed composed. But here he was at 6 a.m., hands still shaking, wondering why he couldn't just let it go. The worst part? He knew intellectually that his boss was just having a bad day. He knew it wasn't personal. His mind understood this completely. Yet his body was still in fight or flight mode. He didn't know it yet, but Marcus was about to discover something that would change everything. He was about to learn that his reaction had nothing to do with his boss, nothing to do with that moment in the conference room, and everything to do with something buried deep inside him, something he'd been running from his entire life. Today, we are placing the stamp of psychological immunity on your mental framework. This isn't about becoming cold. It isn't about not caring. This is about understanding the secret that separates those who crumble from pressure and those who remain unshaken. This is Carl Jung's hidden truth, the framework that shows you why nothing external can truly affect you unless you allow something unresolved inside you to welcome it in. Secret 1. The world acts as your personal mirror. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you felt genuinely triggered by someone else's behavior? Not mildly annoyed, not slightly frustrated. I'm talking about that deep, visceral reaction where someone's words or actions create a response in you that feels disproportionate to what actually happened. Think about it. Carl Jung said something profound that most people never truly understand. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Here's the truth. Every person who irritates you is showing you something about yourself that you're refusing to see. Your boss's arrogance. It irritates you because you have an arrogant part of yourself that you've disowned. That friend who's always complaining. Their victim mentality triggers something in you, an aspect of yourself that plays the victim role and that you've condemned. The person who always seems to get what they want through manipulation. Their dishonesty bothers you because you have a dishonest part that you've labeled as not who I am. Jung taught us, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This is shadow work. This is the foundation of psychological immunity. You see, the external world is neutral, completely neutral. Words have no inherent power. A comment from a colleague is just air vibration. It has no emotional charge by itself. The emotional charge comes from inside you. It comes from an unhealed wound that the outside world just happened to poke. When you understand this, you realize something profound. Nobody can hurt you with an external attack unless there's an internal wound ready to receive that attack. Think about it this way. If someone insults your intelligence and you immediately feel shame and anger, it's not because they're right. It's because somewhere in your past you decided you weren't smart enough. That belief lives in your unconscious. That wound is open. So their words found a target. They found unfinished business. But here's the revolutionary part. Once you become aware of that wound, once you bring it into consciousness, the external attack loses all its power. The same words, the same situation, but now it can't touch you because there's nothing inside you for it to hook into. This is the beginning of psychological immunity. This is why Marcus's boss's comment had such a devastating impact. It wasn't about the words. It was about the part of Marcus that believed those words were true, a part he'd never acknowledged, never examined, never healed. His unconscious was running the show, and he didn't even know it was possible to take control. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button. Thank you for your support. Around this point, Marcus started keeping a journal. Not the kind where you write about your day. He started writing about his triggers. Whenever he felt that rise of emotion, that reactive charge, he wrote it down. Who triggered him? What did they do? What did he feel? And then the crucial question, when was the first time he felt this way? What old wound was being activated? The first entry was about his boss. The second was about his father. By the fourth entry, Marcus started seeing the pattern. He wasn't angry at his boss for criticizing him in public. He was angry at his father for criticizing him privately, for making him believe that his worth was tied to his performance, that one mistake meant he was a failure. His boss's comment had reopened a wound that was 30 years old. Secret 2. The illusion of control disguised as power. There's a lie that most people live their entire lives believing. It's the lie that if they can just control enough variables, if they can control how people perceive them, how people treat them, if they can control outcomes, then they'll finally be safe. Then they'll finally be at peace. This is the trap of the illusion of control. Epictetus, the ancient Stoic philosopher, made a distinction that changed everything. He said, "Some things are in your control, and some things are not in your control." And then he defined exactly what's in your control: your beliefs, your desires, your goals, your judgments, and your actions. Everything else, other people's opinions, their behaviors, circumstances, outcomes, is completely outside your control. Think about it. You cannot control your boss. You cannot control your co-workers. You cannot control traffic. You cannot control the economy. You cannot control what people think about you. You can't control any of it. And yet, we spend our entire lives exhausted, stressed, and frustrated because we're trying to do exactly that. The person trying to control how everyone perceives them, they're trapped. They're constantly performing, constantly filtering, constantly terrified of making a mistake that might crack the image they've constructed. They have zero psychological immunity because they're dependent on external circumstances staying exactly as they want them. The person with psychological immunity has made a different choice. They've released the false belief that they can control the world, and in that release, they've found actual freedom. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this concept when he wrote about the will to power, not the will to control others, but the will to master yourself. There is one thing alone that matters: to have the courage to face life, he said. The courage to face life as it actually is, not as you wish it to be. Let me ask you something. How much of your mental energy right now is spent trying to control things that are completely outside your control? How many hours have you spent worrying about what someone else thinks of you? That energy is wasted. That energy is leaking out of you like water from a broken vessel. True power comes from this: controlling what's yours to control. Your interpretation, your response, your mindset, your actions, and releasing everything else entirely. When you accept that you can't control how people will treat you, something shifts. You stop needing their approval. You stop crafting your every word to be palatable. You stop checking and rechecking your work because you're terrified of judgment. You become genuinely free. This is why Marcus's anxiety began to dissolve once he understood this principle. He couldn't control what his boss said. He couldn't control how his boss perceived him. But he could control how he responded. He could control whether he believed the criticism or not. He could control whether he let that comment define his entire evening. And when he focused only on what was his to control, the external noise lost its volume. Drop this affirmation in the comments. I protect my energy. Say it out loud. Anchor it. Because once you start protecting your energy by releasing what you cannot control, you'll be amazed at how much psychological space opens up inside you. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button. Thank you for your support. Secret 3. The false self and the shadow self. Here's something most people never realize. You've been living as a constructed version of yourself your entire life. Jung called this the false self. It's the version of you that you created based on what your parents rewarded, what your culture approved of, what you believed you had to be loved and accepted. It's a mask. It works. For years, maybe decades, it works beautifully. But here's what happens on the other side of that mask. All the parts of you that don't fit the acceptable image get pushed into the darkness. That's the shadow self. And here's the critical insight. Your reactions are controlled by the shadow self. Your triggers come from the shadow. Your compulsions, your irrational fears, your self-sabotage, that's all shadow work trying to emerge, trying to get your attention, trying to make itself known. Marcus had constructed a false self. He was the competent guy, the reliable employee, the one who always gets it right. His entire identity was built on performance and competence. But inside that shadow was a terrified child who believed he was fundamentally inadequate. That child was disowned. That child was locked away. But that child was still running the show every time someone criticized him. Think about the parts of yourself you refuse to acknowledge. Maybe you've told yourself you're not lazy, but there's a lazy part of you. Maybe you've told yourself you're not selfish, but there's a selfish part in there. Maybe you've told yourself you're not afraid, but there's a terrified part hiding in the shadow, and it's destroying your life without your conscious permission. The secret to psychological immunity is to stop fighting the shadow and start integrating it. This doesn't mean becoming selfish or lazy or afraid. It means acknowledging that these aspects exist within you, understanding why they exist, and then consciously deciding how to work with them rather than against them. The moment Marcus acknowledged the inadequate, fearful part of himself, the part that believed his worth was contingent on performance, something changed. He wasn't trying to be the perfectly competent guy anymore. He was just being, and paradoxically, that's when he actually became better at his work. Because he wasn't doing it from a place of fear and desperation, he was doing it from a place of choice. Let me ask you something. What parts of yourself have you been trying to hide? What aspects have you been rejecting and pushing into the shadow? Because those are the exact aspects that have been controlling your life from underneath, creating reactions you don't understand and behavior you can't explain. An ancient proverb says, "The wound is the place where the light enters you. Your shadow contains the wounded parts." But here's the thing, those wounds, once acknowledged and healed, become your greatest sources of strength. The parts you've been trying to reject are actually your teachers. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button. Thank you for your support. Marcus at the turning point. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus started his journal. He was in a meeting when something happened that would have destroyed him before. His boss made a critical comment. But this time, something was different. He felt the reaction rising, that familiar tight chest, the heat in his face. But instead of pushing it down or letting it overwhelm him, he simply noticed it. He observed it like a scientist observing data. There's the fear, there's the shame, there's the defensive anger trying to convince him he should fight back. He didn't act on any of it. He didn't defend himself. He didn't make excuses. He just acknowledged what he was feeling and why. Because now he understood that reaction wasn't about the boss. It was about Marcus, and only Marcus. It was the inadequate part of himself screaming for attention. But here's the remarkable part. His boss's perception of him actually shifted. Not because Marcus did anything different outwardly. He actually did the same work, with the same effort. But something in his energy changed. He was no longer desperate for approval. He was no longer fragile underneath the confident exterior. He was actually becoming genuinely confident. grounded in reality, not dependent on someone else's opinion. That's when Marcus understood something deeper. It wasn't just about managing his reaction, it was about becoming the kind of person who couldn't be affected by an external attack because there was no internal wound for it to trigger. Secret 4. Perception is the only real power. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in Rome, wrote something in his private journal that captures this truth. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. This is the foundation of psychological immunity. This is the secret that separates those who remain unshaken from those who crumble. The world itself is neutral. It has no inherent meaning. It's not good or bad. It's not fair or unfair. These are filters. These are perceptual overlays that your mind places on top of reality. And here's what most people never understand. You get to choose those filters. You're not stuck with the ones you inherited from your childhood. Think about two people experiencing the exact same circumstance. One person loses their job and sees it as a catastrophe. The other person sees it as an opportunity. The circumstance is identical. The difference is entirely in their perception. And here's the crucial part. That perception is trainable. It's not fixed. When you think the world is against you, you see evidence of that everywhere. When you think the world is conspiring in your favor, you see different evidence. Same world, different filter, different life. This is why people with psychological immunity cannot be broken by external circumstances. Not because circumstances don't happen to them, they do, but because they understand that they're not victims of circumstances. They're choosers of interpretation. They're architects of meaning. Let me ask you something. What meaning have you been assigning to the difficult experiences in your life? Has something tragic happened to you and you've decided that this means the world is cruel? Has someone betrayed you and you've decided that means you can't trust people? Has a failure occurred and you've decided that means you're incapable? These interpretations aren't facts. They're stories. Stories that you can rewrite. Think about the most resilient people you know. Do you think bad things don't happen to them? No. Bad things happen to everyone. The difference is in how they've learned to interpret those events. They've learned to see failure as feedback, not as identity. They've learned to see rejection as redirection, not as proof of inadequacy. They've learned to see obstacles as opportunities to grow rather than reasons to quit. This is perception mastery. This is the ability to step outside the automatic interpretation your unconscious mind generates and consciously choose a different frame. Psychological immunity doesn't mean you become unaffected by your circumstances. It means you become uncontrolled by them. It means you can experience difficulty without letting that difficulty write the story of who you are. Around this time, Marcus realized something about his perception. He'd been interpreting his boss's criticism as an attack on his fundamental worth. But there was another possible interpretation. His boss was giving him useful feedback that could help him improve. Those two interpretations were equally valid, but one made him defensive and shut down. The other made him learning-oriented and resilient. Which interpretation do you think gave him more power? Drop this affirmation in the comments. I am the observer, not the reaction. This is the affirmation of someone developing perception mastery. You're not your reaction, you're the consciousness that observes your reaction. You're the one who gets to choose what meaning you assign to what happens. You're the architect of your own interpretation. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button. Thank you for your support. Secret 5. Emotional detachment is not coldness. There's a massive misunderstanding about what emotional detachment actually means. Most people think it means you become cold, unfeeling, disconnected from life. That's not what it means at all. In fact, that's the opposite of psychological immunity. Emotional detachment means this: you experience your emotions fully. you feel everything, but you're no longer puppeteered by them. You're no longer subject to their whims. There's a difference between feeling an emotion and being controlled by an emotion. There's a difference between being a prisoner of your reactions and being an observer of them. Think about water. When water gets agitated, it becomes turbulent. But water, by itself, has no inherent turbulence. The turbulence is a response to something external: wind, rocks, currents. The water itself remains water. It can be calm or turbulent, but it doesn't become a different substance based on what disturbs it. It simply responds and then returns to its nature. You're like that. You can feel emotional turbulence. You can experience difficult emotions, but you don't have to identify with them. You don't have to believe they're the truth about who you are or what's possible. Let me ask you something. How many times have you done something you regretted because you were emotionally reactive? How many relationships have been damaged by emotional overreaction? How many opportunities have been lost because you let your immediate emotional response dictate your actions? When you develop the capacity to observe your emotions without being swept away by them, everything changes. You can be angry and still choose not to say something you'll regret. You can be hurt and still choose to respond with kindness. You can be afraid and still choose to take action. This is the space where actual power lives. Carl Jung understood this when he said, "The unconscious mind of man sees correctly even when conscious reason is blind. But that unconscious mind sees through emotions, through reactivity, through patterns. When you develop the capacity to notice those patterns without being controlled by them, you're no longer unconscious. You're conscious, you're awake." Think about the difference between Marcus in the beginning, where an emotional reaction controlled his entire evening, and Marcus, after understanding this principle, he could still feel the initial sting of criticism. But now he could observe that sting. He could understand it, and he could choose not to let it determine his actions or his self-concept. This is what psychological immunity actually looks like. It's not numbness, it's clarity. It's the ability to experience your full humanity without being controlled by your reactions. Around this point, Marcus did something interesting. He started meditating, not to escape his emotions, but to practice observing them. For 10 minutes every morning, he would sit and just notice what came up. When an anxious thought appeared, he wouldn't fight it. He wouldn't try to suppress it. He would just observe it. There's anxiety. There's the thought that I'm not good enough. There's the impulse to prove myself. By the end of those 10 minutes, something miraculous would happen. The emotions would still be there, but they'd lost their charge. They were just data, just information, not commands that he had to follow. This is the meditation of psychological immunity. This is how you transform from being a prisoner of your reactions to being their observer and architect. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button. Thank you for your support. Secret 6. Rewiring your reactive brain. Your brain is remarkable. It's also working against you if you let it run on autopilot. Here's how it works. Every time you have an experience, your brain creates a neural pathway. Every time you have that experience again, the pathway gets stronger. After hundreds or thousands of repetitions, the pathway becomes so ingrained that it's automatic. You don't have to think. Your brain just fires the pattern. This is called neural entrenchment. For Marcus, this pattern was: criticism triggers shame, triggers defensive anger, triggers avoidance. That neural pathway had been carved into his brain over decades. It started when his father criticized him, and it had been reinforced thousands of times since then. His brain was essentially running an automatic program. But here's the good news. Neuroplasticity is real. Your brain can be rewired. New pathways can be created, but it requires conscious repetition. It requires you to choose a different response so many times that the new pathway eventually becomes as automatic as the old one. Think about it this way. When you were learning to drive, driving took all your conscious attention. You couldn't think about anything else. But after thousands of hours, driving became automatic. You can now drive while thinking about something completely different. The skill has been encoded into your neural circuitry. The same principle applies to psychological immunity. You can practice observing your emotions without reacting. You can practice choosing a different interpretation. You can practice releasing control over things you can't control. And eventually, these new patterns become automatic. You don't have to struggle. It just becomes who you are. This is the real meaning of mind over matter. It's not that your mind magically controls reality. It's that through your mind, through conscious choice, repeated practice, deliberate attention, you rewire your nervous system. You create new neural pathways that support psychological immunity instead of fragility. Let me ask you something. What automatic patterns are you running? What reactions happen so fast that you don't even realize you have a choice until after you've already reacted? Those are your entrenched neural pathways. And yes, they're powerful, but they're not permanent. They can be rewired. The practice is simple. Every time you notice a reactive pattern starting, pause, take a breath, and consciously choose something different. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be different. And each time you do this, you're creating a new neural pathway. You're training your brain for psychological immunity. Marcus practiced this for weeks. Every time he felt criticism coming his way, he would pause. He would notice the shame arising, and instead of either attacking back or shutting down, he would take a breath and ask himself, "What can I learn from this?" It was awkward at first. It took conscious effort, but after enough repetitions, something shifted. His brain started defaulting to the learning question before the shame even had a chance to fully activate. That's neural rewiring. That's psychological immunity being built into your actual neurobiology. Think about it. Your brain doesn't actually know the difference between something you practice in meditation and something you practice in real life. Every time you practice observing your emotions without reacting, you're training your nervous system. You're making psychological immunity automatic rather than aspirational. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button. Thank you for your support. Secret 7. Becoming the player, not the pawn. Life is like a chessboard. Most people are living as pawns, moving because they're told to move, reacting because the board requires them to react, believing they have no agency in their own game. A pawn doesn't decide where to go. The player decides. A pawn doesn't create strategy. The player creates strategy. A pawn is subject to the board. The player is the architect of the board. Most people are pawns in their own lives. They're reacting to circumstances. They're responding to what happens to them. They're controlled by external events and other people's actions. This person did this to me, so I have to respond this way. This situation happened, so I have no choice. They're defending, not creating. They're responding, not initiating. Psychological immunity means becoming the player instead of the pawn. It means understanding that you have agency, you have choice, you have strategic options that you've never considered because you've been too busy being reactive. Think about the difference. A pawn in chess has limited options. It can only move forward. But the player can see the entire board. The player can see multiple moves ahead. The player can sacrifice pieces strategically. The player can set traps. The player can create opportunities. When you have psychological immunity, you see the board differently. Someone insults you. You see that move and you understand the psychology behind it. Someone tries to manipulate you. You see the strategy and you can decide if you want to engage with it or not. Someone creates chaos around you. You can see your options and choose which ones serve you. This requires a specific shift in consciousness. It requires you to stop seeing yourself as a victim of circumstances and start seeing yourself as a player with agency. It requires you to ask different questions. Given this situation, what are my actual options? Which of these options aligns with my values and my vision? What move should I make? Let me ask you something. In most areas of your life, are you playing the game or are you being played? Are you strategizing or are you just reacting? Are you creating the outcome or are you suffering the outcome? Friedrich Nietzsche talked about this with the concept of will to power, not dominating others, but mastering yourself. Claiming agency, refusing victimhood, creating your own meaning and direction rather than accepting the one that circumstances try to impose on you. When Marcus finally understood this, it transformed everything. He wasn't just managing his reaction to criticism anymore. He was being strategic about his entire career. He was asking, what do I actually want? Where do I want to go? And how can I use every experience, including criticism, as data for my strategy? He went from being a pawn, moved around by his boss's moods and his company's demands, to being a player with his own game. This is the ultimate expression of psychological immunity. It's not just about being unaffected by external circumstances. It's about being so grounded in your own agency and so clear on your own strategy that external circumstances become resources for your game rather than threats to your well-being. Think about the most powerful people you know, not powerful in the sense of dominating others, but powerful in the sense of being unshakable, clear and purposeful. Do you think they're unaffected by what happens to them? No, but they've mastered the ability to translate what happens to them into strategic advantage. They've become the player. They've stopped being the pawn. And here's what's revolutionary. You can do this too. Not because you're special, but because you're human, and all humans have the capacity for this. You have the capacity to observe your conditioning instead of being unconscious to it. You have the capacity to choose your response instead of being reactive. You have the capacity to create your own game instead of suffering someone else's. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button. Thank you for your support. Marcus, 6 months later. It was a regular Tuesday when Marcus's boss called him into the office. Marcus didn't feel the familiar panic rise. He was curious. He wanted to know what was happening. That was the real change, from defensiveness to curiosity. His boss told him he was being promoted, more responsibility, more visibility, a bigger platform for potential criticism. The old Marcus would have felt the terror of exposure, the pressure to be perfect, the desperation not to fail. He would have accepted the role while secretly being terrified. But Marcus was different now. He understood something fundamental. A promotion in status means nothing to your psychological immunity. A bigger platform means more eyes, but those eyes don't have the power to determine who you are. Criticism at a higher level is still just information, still just external noise, still something that cannot touch you unless you allow something unresolved inside you to be activated by it. So he accepted the promotion without the burden of desperation. He took the role with genuine interest in the work, not with fear of judgment. And something interesting happened. He actually excelled. Not because he was trying harder or sacrificing more of himself to be perfect, but because he was actually there, fully present, not half his consciousness consumed by managing anxiety and proving his worth. The irony of psychological immunity is this. The more you stop trying to control how people perceive you, the better their perception of you actually becomes. The more you release the need to be protected from criticism, the more resilient and capable you actually become. The more you integrate your shadow instead of fighting it, the more genuinely confident and authentic you become. Marcus had become unshakable, not because nothing could touch him, but because he understood something so deeply that nothing could touch the core of who he was. And that understanding came from one principle. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. He'd made it conscious, and in that consciousness he'd found his actual power, the stamp of psychological immunity. You are not subject to the external world. You are not a victim of circumstance. You are not controlled by what happens to you. These are illusions created by unconsciousness. The 7 secrets we've explored today are not complicated. They're not difficult to understand intellectually, but they're profoundly difficult to integrate because they require you to challenge everything you've been taught about how the world works. You've been taught that other people have the power to hurt you. That's not true. Other people have the power to create circumstances. The hurt comes from inside you, from an unhealed wound, from an unconscious belief, from an entrenched neural pattern. Once you see that, once you truly understand it, external attacks lose all their power. You've been taught that your emotional reactions are who you are. That's not true. You are the consciousness that observes your reactions. You're the architect who can choose different responses. Your emotions are data, not destiny. You've been taught that success means being liked, being approved of, being validated by external sources. That's not true. Success is becoming psychologically autonomous. It's understanding what you actually want, independent of what you've been conditioned to want. It's choosing your actions based on your values rather than based on fear or seeking validation. These secrets we've talked about, they all point to one thing: the development of psychological immunity, the ability to experience the full turbulence of existence without being displaced by it. The ability to remain grounded in yourself even when the external world is chaotic. Let me ask you this: which of these secrets resonated most with you? Which one revealed something about your own unconscious patterns? Which one gave you a hint of what's possible if you actually developed psychological immunity? Think about your current life. Think about the areas where you feel controlled by external circumstances. Think about the people who trigger you, the situations that devastate you, the outcomes that you're desperately trying to control. All of that is showing you where you have unfinished business. All of that is showing you where you're still unconscious. But here's the thing: now you know. You now understand the framework. You now see how it works. The question is, what are you going to do with this understanding? Today we have placed the stamp of psychological immunity on your mental framework. This is a stamp that says, I am no longer subject to unconscious patterns. I am building awareness. I am integrating my shadow. I am choosing my perception. I am becoming unshakable. I am becoming the player in my own game, not the pawn. Which stamp are you adding to your mindset today? Tell me in the comments. Are you committing to psychological immunity? Are you willing to do the shadow work, to examine your triggers, to rewrite your interpretations, to rewire your neural patterns? Are you ready to become genuinely unshakable, not by becoming numb, but by becoming conscious? Tell me in the comments. Tell me which of these secrets you're going to practice first. Tell me where you're going to start building your psychological immunity. Because once you understand this, once you truly get that nothing external can affect you unless you allow something unresolved inside you to welcome it in, you become a force. Not a force that dominates others, but a force that creates. A force that stays true to itself, regardless of circumstances. A force that can't be broken because you're no longer fragile. That's the promise of psychological immunity. That's the hidden truth Carl Jung was trying to show us. And that's your next level. That's who you're becoming. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your willingness to question the narratives you've been living within. That's where transformation begins. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button. Thank you for your support. Subscribe, comment, tell me your biggest takeaway, and I'll see you in the next video where we go even deeper into the psychology of mental toughness and unshakable discipline. The stamp is yours. Now own it.